Today in Great Stories in Bioethics, my personal YouTube channel, I want to tell you about 10 crazy ideas by brilliant physicians that were initially rejected by their contemporary physicians as crazy and wrong, and it turned out to be true. This is a very important lesson of being tolerant of new ideas in medicine. So, to go back in time, the first one was John Snow, considered the father of epidemiology, and his famous observation that cholera seemed to be spread from the quadrant of London served by the Broad Street pump. He published about this. He didn't, of course, know about germs. At the time, the germ theory wasn't really accepted until about 1900. Snow lived between 1813 and 1858, but he knew that there was something about the water that was causing cholera to spread. He later learned that the well that served the Broad Street pump was only 3 feet deep, and it was close to a cesspit where there were diapers, infected with feces, near the well. And we know that now that cholera is a waterborne fecal bacteria. However, it took a long time for Snow's ideas to be accepted. He took the Great Stink of 1858, where the air in London from all the different latrines going into the creeks and rivers was so horrible that people fled to the countryside. It took a long, long time to actually, for people in London to tax themselves and build sewers that didn't go into drinking water, as obvious as that sounds now. It wasn't until about 1875 that London's water became basically safe. So it took a long time for Snow's ideas to be accepted. The next position I want to tell you about is Ignaz Semmelweis, which every med student and doctor name should know. He was a Hungarian physician of German descent who lived between 1818 and 1865. He observed that there was something physicians were doing in poor hospitals that seemed to be spreading childbed fever. So at the time, women who were giving birth were lined up like almost an assembly line, in stirrups, and physicians in white coats, noblesse oblige, treating the poor women, would go from woman to woman, examining them and sometimes helping give birth, but also spreading germs. Semmelweis suggested that washing your hands, especially in chlorinated water, could dramatically reduce the spread of all germs, especially childhood fever. He proved this, but his ideas was ridiculed because the idea that upper-class doctors were actually spreading some disease to poor women just was unacceptable. In fact, he was treated so badly that he was reportedly driven crazy, and in an insane asylum, he was beaten, and it looks like a wound from being beaten in his hand turned gangrene, which ended up killing him. So it's a very sad story. His theory really wasn't accepted in medicine until Joseph Lister started antiseptic surgery, and also when Louis Pasteur created the first vaccine against rabies and pasteurization. But it took a long, long time for Semmelweis's ideas to be accepted. So the next thing I want to tell you about is not a physician so much, but it's the idea that syphilis was conveyed by some kind of germ and not bad behavior. We now know that spirochetes transmit syphilis during sex, especially unprotected sex. During World War I, generals realized that if soldiers had condoms, the rate of syphilis would go down. There were people against giving out condoms because they thought that if there was no comeback from bad behavior, then people would have sex everywhere. And so there was a split between fighting the causes of the syphilis and fighting bad behavior. Later, a physician named Thomas Parham, when penicillin was developed, actually opposed giving penicillin to people who had syphilis, even though it was considered a magic bullet, because Parham thought that syphilis was punishment for sin, and we needed that. We didn't need to be just fighting spirochetes. There is a great book about this by Ludwig Fleck called Genesis of a Scientific Fact, about just how long it took people to accept not only the germ theory of disease, but also the idea that germs cause disease and not sin. So the next idea I want to tell you about, I've already talked about it in a previous episode, but it's in vitro fertilization. And for a long time, people believed not only that it was impossible to do a spermionectomy outside the womb, but that it was wrong, that it was, was only one natural way to create a baby. And that when Steptoe and Edwards in 1978 created Louise Brown, that some kind of great border crossing had occurred that was unethical and wrong. There was a big hue and cry, of course, at the time, as a previous episode has documented. One physician scientist wrote that this is more important than nuclear warfare, but that wasn't true. And now we have millions of wanted babies created by IVF, thanks to Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe. I got a little bit ahead of time going to IVF, but I also should have mentioned Edward Jenner and the first vaccine against smallpox. And as we know, Jenner experimented on a boy with giving him a vaccine against cowpox, which had a kind of spillover vaccine against smallpox. And then the idea came that you give a mild version of smallpox, through the relation or the vaccine, you'd be protected. And George Washington later, controversially, had his troops vaccinated in order to win the Revolutionary War. But this was a very controversial idea at the time. It took a long, long time for another vaccine to be created. It wasn't until Pasteur created the vaccine against rabies. And even today, vaccination, of course, is very controversial. So the next idea I want to tell you about has to do with Stanley Prusiner and prions. So for a long time, it was thought that only three things could be infectious: bacteria, viruses, and protozoa. Prusiner, who was brilliant and worked in neurology all his life, thought there was something strange causing mad cow disease and spongiform encephalopathies, and believed that something was being transmitted, maybe from cows who were infected, were eating the dead meat of lambs of Strappi. And he basically postulated that a protein was the cause, the culprit. It was a very heretical idea. He coined the term prion for proteinaceous and infectious. Basically, the idea that a protein could be passed on and infect people in the brain and cause some very bad damage. The next heretical idea I want to tell you about is the idea that, for a long time when I grew up with this, the idea that ulcers are caused by either stress or too much stomach acid. And it wasn't until very, very late, 1983, that some Australians, especially Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, proved that this was false. That ulcers are not caused by stress or too much stomach acid, but by Helicobacter pylori, commonly known as Campylobacter. It's basically a bacterium. And although probably half the people in the world have it, only a certain number develop ulcers. And it can be treated with antibiotics. You would think that such a breakthrough would be instantly accepted, but it was not. So finally, the last idea I want to tell you about, I remember 1980s looking at a textbook of mammalian physiology and cell biology. There was a line: once cells become differentiated, they cannot be returned to an undifferentiated state. We know from the cloning of the lamb Dolly now that that's not true. But what we don't know is that there was a Danish scientist named Stig Wilhelmsen, who was actually, in some ways, the brains behind all this. According to a book on cloning by the New York Times science writer Dieter Kalata, Steve was the kind of person who takes introduction to biology, and rather than memorizing it, he's kind of a contrarian and tried to figure out what was wrong in the textbook. This is the guy who basically is very shy and shuns publicity and is not very well known in his pivotal role. But without him, the folks at the Rosalind Institute in Scotland could not have done what they did with Dolly. And of course, later, the great Yamanaka figured out, and he won a Nobel Prize for this, how to basically tweak 4 genes in a cell and make the cell return to an undifferentiated state, creating a kind of revolution in therapy. and eliminating the need for embryos for research on medicine. And finally, final idea is the idea of deep brain stimulation for, especially for Parkinson's disease. I was once on the IRB, it's UAB, when a neurosurgeon named John Smithies, who was English, proposed this for people in comas or Parkinson's. And I remember a very dominant female researcher who kind of was very powerful on the board, just ridiculing this idea, just thought it was completely crazy, completely wrong. It was never approved. And now there's some really remarkable videos of people, Parkinson's being returned with their shaking, stopping. It's now a very standard treatment.
This is what it looks like without the medicine and the stimulator. And now we're just going to turn it on. See how that feels. How you feel?
I feel a lot better. So that's it for today. Just hopefully learning all this makes us a little bit more tolerant, and we'll try to focus the evidence and not just accept the status quo. If you like this, give me a thumbs up, share. See you next Tuesday at 4 p.m.